The morning sun painted the Arizona Territory in shades of gold and amber as the town of Dusty Creek prepared for what should have been the most joyous day in young Sarah Beth Thompson's life. Church bells rang out across the desert landscape, their bronze voices carrying promises of love and new beginnings. But destiny had other plans brewing in the Badlands beyond the mesa. Sarah Beth stood before her bedroom mirror in the boarding house above Miller's General Store, her reflection shimmering like a desert mirage. Her wedding dress, made of the finest white cotton her father could afford, cascaded around her slender frame like fresh snow against the red rock country. The dress had taken her mother 3 months to sew, every stitch a prayer for her daughter's happiness. Delicate pearl buttons climbed up the back and Belgian lace adorned the collar, a luxury in these frontier times. "You look beautiful as a summer rain, sweetheart," whispered her mother, Margaret Thompson, as she fastened the pearl necklace that had belonged to Sarah Beth's grandmother. The necklace had traveled all the way from Virginia when the family had packed their lives into a covered wagon and followed the promise of gold and opportunity westward in 1882. Sarah Beth's eyes sparkled with excitement and nerves. At 19, she possessed the kind of natural beauty that could stop a cattle drive in its tracks. Her auburn hair caught the morning light like polished copper, and her green eyes held the depth of mountain lakes. But it was her spirit that truly set her apart, a fierce independence that matched the untamed land around them. "Do you think he'll really come back in time?" Sarah Beth asked, her voice carrying the slightest tremor of worry. Her intended, Deputy Marshal Jake Morrison, had ridden out 3 days earlier with a posse to track down the notorious Crimson Canyon Gang. The outlaws had been terrorizing the territory for months, robbing banks, rustling cattle, and leaving a trail of fear in their wake. Led by the ruthless Black Jack Cordero, the gang was wanted in 3 territories with a combined bounty of $5,000 on their heads. "That young man would ride through hell itself to marry you today," Margaret assured her daughter, though worry creased her own brow. She had seen too many good men ride out into the desert and never return. Jake Morrison was everything a frontier lawman should be: brave, honorable, and quick with both his wit and his Colt .45. At 25, he had already earned a reputation as one of the finest trackers in the Arizona Territory. His steel-gray eyes could read the desert like a book, following trails that others couldn't even see. Standing 6 feet tall in his boots, with shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of justice, Jake commanded respect wherever he rode. He had courted Sarah Beth for over a year, bringing her wildflowers from the desert and books from his travels to Phoenix and Tucson. Their love had blossomed like a desert rose after a rare rain, beautiful, precious, and strong enough to survive in harsh conditions. The church, a modest wooden structure with a bell tower that could be seen for miles across the flat desert, began filling with townspeople. Dusty Creek wasn't much to look at, just a collection of buildings clustered around a main street that turned to mud when the rains came and choking dust when they didn't. But it was home to nearly 200 souls who had carved out lives in this unforgiving land. There was Doc Henderson, who had delivered half the babies in town and patched up the other half after various mishaps. Mrs. Abernathy ran the schoolhouse and could recite Shakespeare while teaching children to read using whatever books could be found. Tom Miller owned the general store and served as the unofficial mayor, his scale honest and his credit generous to families down on their luck. The western frontier of the 1880s was a place where communities were built on trust and mutual dependence. When trouble came, whether it was Apache raids, flash floods, or outlaw gangs, neighbors became family, and survival depended on standing together. As the morning wore on and the appointed hour of noon approached, an uneasy silence settled over the gathered crowd. Sarah Beth waited in the church's small side room, her bouquet of desert marigolds and sage trembling in her hands. The flowers had been picked before dawn by her younger brother Timothy, who at 15 was already showing the makings of a fine cowhand. Sheriff Tom Bradley paced outside the church, his spurs jingling with each step. A weathered man in his 50s, Bradley had been keeping the peace in Dusty Creek for over a decade. His mustache was more gray than brown now, and his face bore the lines of too many hard decisions and sleepless nights. He checked his pocket watch for the 100th time. "Still no sign of them," he muttered to Doc Henderson, who stood beside him scanning the horizon with field glasses. "That boy's never been late for anything in his life," Doc replied, lowering the glasses. "Something's wrong, Tom. I can feel it in my bones, and these old bones don't lie." The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, a vast canvas of red rock, sagebrush, and creosote. To the east lay Crimson Canyon, a maze of towering sandstone walls and hidden caves that had sheltered everyone from Apache warriors to Spanish conquistadors over the centuries. The canyon got its name from the iron oxide that stained the rocks the color of dried blood. especially when the setting sun struck them just right. It was perfect outlaw country, countless hiding places, water sources known only to those who had spent years learning the desert's secrets, and escape routes that could confound even the most experienced trackers. Many a posse had ridden into those crimson walls only to emerge days later empty-handed and demoralized. As the sun reached its zenith, casting short shadows in the dusty street, a lone rider appeared on the horizon. But it wasn't Jake Morrison. Instead, it was Hank Wheeler, one of the posse members, slumped in his saddle and barely conscious. His horse, a sturdy bay gelding, moved at a slow walk, its head hanging low with exhaustion. Sheriff Bradley and several townsmen rushed to meet the rider. Wheeler's shirt was torn and blood-stained, and his face bore the pallor of a man who had seen too much. "Hank, what happened? Where's Jake and the others?" Bradley demanded, helping the injured man down from his horse. Wheeler's voice came out as a harsh whisper. "Ambush, in the canyon. They were waiting for us. Black Jack, he knew we were coming." He coughed, specks of blood staining his lips. Jake stayed behind to cover our escape. The others, some didn't make it out." A collective gasp rose from the crowd that had gathered. Inside the church, Sarah Beth felt her knees go weak as the terrible news reached her ears. Her wedding bouquet scattered across the floor, the desert marigolds looking suddenly fragile and lost. How many men did Black Jack have with him? Bradley pressed, his lawman's mind already working on the problem. "Too many," Wheeler gasped. "Had to be 15, maybe 20 guns. They knew every rock, every cave. It was like they'd been planning this for weeks." He grabbed the sheriff's arm with surprising strength. "Tom, they got something big planned. Heard them talking about the railroad money coming through Cactus Wells tomorrow." The railroad money. Every month, the territorial government sent a shipment of gold and silver coins to pay the workers laying track across the desert. It was enough money to fund an army of outlaws for a year, and everyone knew the train would be lightly guarded. Just 2 express guards and whatever passengers happened to be aboard. Sheriff Bradley's mind raced. If Black Jack was planning to rob that train, innocent people would die. The afternoon passenger train from Phoenix carried families, traveling salesmen, and Eastern investors looking to make their fortunes in the growing territory. They wouldn't stand a chance against 20 hardened outlaws. But first, there was the matter of Deputy Marshal Jake Morrison and the men trapped in Crimson Canyon. "Doc, see to Hank's wounds," Bradley ordered. "Tom, I need you to send telegrams to every lawman within 100 miles. Tell them what's happening." He turned to address the crowd. "I know this is hard, especially for you, Sarah Beth, but we got men trapped in that canyon, and we got innocent folks about to ride into an ambush tomorrow. I need volunteers." The response was immediate. Despite the danger, despite knowing they might not return, men stepped forward. This was the way of the frontier. When trouble came, you faced it together or you didn't face it at all. Timothy Thompson, Sarah Beth's younger brother, pushed through the crowd. "I'm going with you, Sheriff." "Son, you're too young," Bradley began, but Timothy's eyes blazed with determination. "Jake's like a brother to me and he'd do the same for any of us. I know every inch of that desert, and I shoot as straight as any man here." At 15, Timothy was already tall and lean, with the quick reflexes and steady nerves that came from growing up on the frontier. Sarah Beth appeared in the church doorway, still wearing her wedding dress but with a look of steel resolve on her face. "If my brother's going, then I'm going too." "Absolutely not," her mother protested, but Sarah Beth had already made up her mind. "I can shoot, I can ride, and I know the desert as well as any man here," she declared. "More importantly, Jake is my intended, and no one, not Black Jack Cordero or anyone else, is going to keep me from bringing him home." It was an extraordinary statement in an era when women were expected to stay home and tend to domestic duties while men handled the dangers of frontier life. But the American West was also a place where necessity often trumped convention, and Sarah Beth Thompson had been raised by parents who believed their daughter should be as capable and independent as any son. Sheriff Bradley studied the young woman's face and saw the same determination that had carried her family across 1,000 miles of prairie and desert to build a new life. He had seen that look before in the eyes of pioneers who had faced down everything from tornadoes to war parties and somehow survived. "Can you really shoot straight?" he asked. Sarah Beth's answer came in the form of action. She walked to her father's horse, tied to the hitching post, and drew the Winchester rifle from its saddle scabbard. 50 yards down the street, a tin can sat on a fence post where someone had left it after lunch. Without hesitation, Sarah Beth raised the rifle, sighted briefly, and squeezed the trigger. The can exploded in a shower of metal fragments. "I'll take that as a yes," Bradley said with grim admiration. Within an hour, a rescue party had been assembled. Besides Sheriff Bradley, Timothy, and Sarah Beth, the group included Tom Miller, whose knowledge of the local terrain was encyclopedic, Carlos Mendoza, a vaquero whose family had been working cattle in the territory since before it belonged to the United States, and 6 other men whose courage outweighed their common sense. Sarah Beth had changed from her wedding dress into practical riding clothes, leather chaps, a cotton shirt, and boots that had seen many miles of desert trail. But she kept her grandmother's pearl necklace, a tangible connection to the woman she was supposed to become today. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, the rescue party rode out of Dusty Creek. Behind them, the town settled into an uneasy quiet, with wives and mothers gathering in the church to pray for the safe return of their men. The desert evening was deceptively peaceful. Coyotes called from distant hills, their voices carrying ancient songs across the cooling sand. Night-blooming cereus flowers began to open, their white petals glowing like stars against the darkness. But beneath this serene surface, danger waited in the crimson walls of the canyon ahead. The rescue party made good time across the desert floor, following the clear trail left by Wheeler's exhausted horse. Sarah Beth rode beside her brother Timothy, both of them mounted on their father's finest horses. Sarah Beth on a steady mare named Luna, and Timothy on a spirited gelding called Thunder. Carlos Mendoza served as their scout, his experienced eyes reading the desert like a familiar book. At 45, Carlos had been born in this territory when it still belonged to Mexico, and his knowledge of the land ran deeper than most men's souls. His grandfather had been a Spanish explorer who had mapped much of the region in the early 1800s, and those maps had been passed down through generations of the Mendoza family. "The tracks are still fresh," Carlos reported, riding back to the group. "Wheeler's horse, but also others." The posse split up somewhere ahead. Some went north toward Devil's Backbone Ridge, others headed straight for the canyon mouth. Sheriff Bradley consulted the rough map he carried, sketched from the accounts of various travelers and prospectors who had survived encounters with the canyon's maze-like interior. Crimson Canyon was more than just a simple gorge. It was a complex network of side canyons, hidden valleys, and natural bridges carved by millions of years of flash floods and wind erosion. The ancestral Puebloan peoples had lived in these canyons centuries ago, leaving behind cliff dwellings and petroglyphs that told stories of their daily lives. Spanish conquistadors had explored the region in the 1500s, searching for cities of gold and finding only red rock and endless sky. Later, mountain men and fur trappers had used the canyon as shelter during the harsh desert winters. Now it served as a fortress for some of the most dangerous outlaws in the American West. "How well do you know the canyon?" Bradley asked Carlos. "Better than most, not as well as I'd like," the vaquero replied honestly. "My grandfather's maps show the main passages, but Black Jack's been holed up in there for months. He knows secrets that took the old ones years to discover." As they approached the canyon mouth, the landscape began to change dramatically. The flat desert floor gave way to rolling hills of red sandstone, carved into fantastic shapes by wind and water. Towering mesas rose like ancient fortresses, their tops crowned with hardy desert plants that somehow found purchase in the thin soil. The entrance to Crimson Canyon was an imposing sight, 2 massive walls of red rock rising nearly 300 feet above the desert floor, with a narrow opening between them that seemed to swallow the evening light. Ancient petroglyphs covered the walls near the entrance, spirals and human figures and animals that told stories from a time when the desert had rivers and the hunting was good. "This is where Wheeler's trail meets up with the others," Carlos observed, dismounting to examine the ground more closely. "I count, maybe 8 horses that went in. But look here, only one came back out, and that was Wheeler's mount." The implications were clear and terrible. 7 good men were somewhere inside that maze of red rock, either dead or trapped, while Black Jack Cordero and his gang held every advantage. "We go in quiet," Sheriff Bradley decided. "No talking unless necessary, and keep your eyes open. If they've got sentries posted, we'll be sitting ducks in that narrow entrance." Sarah Beth checked her rifle one more time, ensuring a round was chambered and the safety was off. She had been hunting with her father since she was 12 years old, bringing down deer and elk to help feed the family. But this was different. This wasn't hunting for meat. This was hunting for the man she loved, and the stakes couldn't be higher. The canyon mouth seemed to swallow them as they rode single file between the towering walls. The temperature dropped noticeably once they were out of the direct sunlight, and their horses' hoofbeats echoed strangely in the confined space. Above them, the strip of sky visible between the canyon walls had turned deep purple with the approaching night. About a quarter mile into the canyon, Carlos held up his hand for them to stop. Ahead, the passage split into 3 separate branches, one continuing straight ahead, one angling off to the left toward higher ground, and one dropping down toward what sounded like running water. "Which way?" Bradley whispered. Carlos dismounted again and spent several minutes studying the ground. Horse tracks, boot prints, and other signs told a story for those who knew how to read them. "The posse split up here," he reported in a voice barely above a whisper. "Looks like Jake took 3 men and went left toward the high country. 2 others went straight ahead. The last group went down toward the creek. And the outlaws? Hard to tell with all the traffic, but I guess they were waiting in all 3 directions. This is a perfect spot for an ambush. Anyone riding in would have to make a choice, and no matter which way they chose, they'd be walking into a trap." Sarah Beth felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool canyon air. The image of Jake riding unknowingly into danger made her stomach clench with fear and anger. "We follow Jake's trail," she said firmly. Sheriff Bradley nodded. "That's what I was thinking. Carlos, can you read the tracks well enough to follow them in this light? For a while, but we'll need to find shelter soon. Desert nights can be cold and we'll need daylight to search properly." The left branch of the canyon led steadily upward through a series of natural terraces and rock shelves. In some places the path was wide enough for a wagon to pass through. In others, the riders had to go single file with their legs almost touching the stone walls on either side. Evidence of ancient habitation was everywhere. Carved handholds and footholds showed where the ancestral Puebloans had climbed to reach cave dwellings high in the walls. Pictographs depicted hunting scenes, ceremonial dances, and astronomical observations. One large panel showed what appeared to be a great gathering of people from different tribes, suggesting that these canyons had once been neutral ground where enemies could meet in peace. After an hour of careful climbing, they reached a wider area where several smaller canyons converged. Here, Carlos found more definite signs of the recent battle. "Blood on the rocks," he pointed out grimly. "And look here, brass cartridge cases. Somebody made a fight of it." Sarah Beth dismounted and examined the evidence herself. She had grown up around guns and violence. It was an unavoidable part of frontier life. But seeing the blood spatters on the ancient red stone, knowing that some of it might belong to Jake, made her feel sick and furious at the same time. "How many men?" Sheriff Bradley asked. "Hard to say. At least a dozen fired shots from up there." Carlos pointed to a rocky outcrop about 50 feet above them. "And maybe half that number shot back from down here. But the men down here were caught in the open, bad position." Timothy found something else, a deputy's badge, bent and scarred but still recognizable. It belonged to Tom Harrison, one of Jake's closest friends and a man who had taught Timothy how to rope cattle the previous summer. "Tom's dead," Timothy said quietly, his young voice heavy with grief and anger. They spent the remaining daylight searching for more clues, but the trail became increasingly difficult to follow as night settled over the canyon. Rather than risk getting lost in the maze of passages, Sheriff Bradley made the decision to make camp in a sheltered alcove where ancient people had once lived. The remains of stone walls and fire-blackened ceiling showed that this cave had been used for centuries by travelers seeking shelter. Carlos found a spring of clean water seeping from the rock, and they made a cold camp. No fire that might give away their position to any outlaws who might be watching. As they shared jerky and hardtack in the darkness, Sarah Beth stared up at the narrow strip of stars visible through the canyon opening. Somewhere out there, Jake might be looking at those same stars, assuming he was still alive. The thought that he might be hurt or worse was almost too painful to bear. "Tell me about the first time you met Jake," Timothy said softly, perhaps sensing his sister's need for distraction. Sarah Beth smiled despite her fears. "It was at the church social last spring. He'd just arrived in town to take the deputy job, and he looked so serious in his Sunday best. Mrs. Abernathy introduced us, and the first thing he said was, 'Miss Thompson, would you care to dance? Because I should warn you, I'm much better at tracking outlaws than I am at keeping time to music.' Did you dance with him?" "I did, and he stepped on my feet 3 times during the first song. But he was trying so hard to be a gentleman, and he had this way of looking at me like I was the most interesting thing he'd ever seen. After the dance, he walked me home and told me about growing up in Colorado, about how he'd always wanted to be a lawman because his father had been killed by claim jumpers when Jake was just 14. The story painted a picture of the kind of man the American West seemed to produce. Someone who had faced tragedy young and channeled it into a determination to protect others from the same fate." "He sounds like a good man," Carlos observed. "The best," Sarah Beth agreed. "He's honest, brave, and kind. When old Mrs. Peterson's husband died last winter, Jake spent his own money to buy her groceries and firewood. He never told anyone about it. I only found out because I saw him carrying supplies to her cabin. Sheriff Bradley had been listening while keeping watch at the cave entrance. That's the kind of man worth fighting for, he said. Get some rest, all of you. Tomorrow we'll need to be at our best. But sleep proved elusive for most of the rescue party. The canyon around them was alive with sounds, the hoot of owls, the rustle of small creatures moving through the brush, and occasionally, the distant echo of what might have been human voices or might have been the wind playing tricks with the stone walls. Sarah Beth lay on her bedroll, staring into the darkness and thinking about the wedding that should have happened today. By now, she and Jake should have been dancing at their reception, surrounded by friends and family, planning their future together. Instead, she was lying in a cave with a rifle by her side, not knowing if the man she loved was dead or alive. But she wasn't the kind of woman to dwell on what might have been. Tomorrow she would help find Jake Morrison, and God help anyone who tried to stop her. Dawn in Crimson Canyon arrived like a slowly opening flower, with light creeping down the towering walls and painting the red rock in shades of gold and rose. The rescue party was up before full daylight, sharing a cold breakfast of jerky and water while Carlos studied his grandfather's old maps by the early morning glow. According to these, there's a hidden valley about 2 miles further up this canyon, he explained, tracing a faded line on the yellowed paper. It's got water, grass for horses, and only one way in or out. If I was Black Jack Cordero and I wanted a secure hideout, that's where I'd be. Sheriff Bradley examined the map with interest. The Spanish explorers had been thorough in their documentation, marking not only geographical features but also water sources, game trails, and defensible positions. How accurate are these maps? My grandfather used them for 40 years and never got lost, Carlos replied with pride. But they're old and rock slides could have changed some of the passages. Sarah Beth was already checking her rifle and preparing to mount Luna. Every moment they delayed was another moment Jake might be suffering or worse. The thought of him trapped and wounded somewhere in this maze of red stone drove her forward like a spur to a horse's flank. Wait, Timothy called softly. Listen. They all froze, straining their ears. In the distance, echoing strangely off the canyon walls, came the sound of gunfire, not the steady crack of a battle, but single shots fired at irregular intervals. That could be a signal, Sheriff Bradley mused. Or someone putting wounded horses out of their misery, Carlos finished grimly. The gunshots were coming from higher up in the canyon, roughly in the direction they had planned to search. Without further discussion, the rescue party mounted up and began following the ancient trail that wound between towering spires of red sandstone. The path was treacherous in places, with loose rocks that could send a horse tumbling into the depths below. But their mounts were desert-bred and sure-footed, picking their way carefully along ledges that seemed barely wide enough for a man on foot. As they climbed higher, the evidence of yesterday's battle became more apparent. Bullet scars marred the ancient stone, and brass cartridge cases glinted in the morning sun where they had been ejected from rifles and pistols. In one narrow passage, they found a hat that Timothy recognized as belonging to Deputy Marshal Pete Carson. Pete's got a wife and 2 little girls, Timothy said, picking up the hat and examining the bullet hole through its crown. He might still be alive, Sarah Beth said, though her voice carried little conviction. A bullet that went through a man's hat that cleanly usually took part of the man with it. The gunshots had stopped, leaving the canyon wrapped in an eerie silence broken only by the whisper of wind through the rock formations and the occasional call of a hawk circling high overhead. The silence was almost worse than the sound of battle. It suggested that whatever had been happening was now finished. After another hour of careful climbing, Carlos held up his hand for the group to halt. Ahead, the canyon opened into a wider area where several passages converged. And there, scattered across the rocky ground like broken toys, were the bodies of horses and men. Sweet Jesus, Sheriff Bradley breathed. The sight was a massacre. 5 horses lay dead, their bodies already beginning to swell in the desert heat. 3 men in Lawmen's badges were sprawled among the rocks, their bodies positioned in ways that told the story of their final, desperate fight. Sarah Beth forced herself to look at each face, her heart hammering with dread. Tom Harrison lay behind a boulder, his rifle still clutched in his hands. Pete Carson was crumpled near a narrow side passage, apparently shot while trying to find cover. The third man was young Billy Foster, barely 20 years old and new to the deputy job. But Jake Morrison was not among the dead. Tracks lead off that way, Carlos reported, pointing toward a narrow slot canyon that angled upward toward the hidden valley marked on his map. Looks like at least 1 man was taken prisoner. The implications hit them all at once. Jake was alive, but he was in the hands of Black Jack Cordero, a man whose cruelty was legendary throughout the territory. Stories told of prisoners tortured for information, of lawmen found days later tied to cactuses and left to die slowly in the desert sun. "We go after them," Sarah Beth said, her voice steady despite the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. "Now hold on," Sheriff Bradley cautioned. "We're walking into their stronghold with 10 guns against maybe 20. Those aren't good odds." "Then we make better odds," Sarah Beth replied. She pointed to the dead horses scattered around the battlefield. "Look at their brands. Those aren't outlaw horses. They're stolen from ranches all over the territory. Which means Black Jack's men aren't just hiding up there, they're living up there. They've got supplies, equipment, maybe even families." Timothy caught on to his sister's thinking. "You mean they've got something to lose?" "Exactly. They chose this place because it's defensible, but that also means they're trapped. If we can get above them, cut off their escape routes." She left the thought unfinished, but Sheriff Bradley nodded slowly. "It's risky as hell, but it might work. Carlos, what do those maps show about getting above the hidden valley?" Carlos studied the ancient parchment carefully. "There's an old trail here marked as Camino de los Espíritus, the Ghost Trail. It goes way around to the north, follows the rim of the canyon, and comes down behind the valley. But it's marked as dangerous, and my grandfather wrote notes here in Spanish warning about loose rock and narrow passages." "How long would it take?" "Most of the day, and we'd have to go on foot for part of it. But if we could get even 2 or 3 guns above their camp." Sarah Beth was already moving, gathering supplies from her saddlebags. "Timothy and I will take the high trail. The rest of you create a distraction from the front. When you hear our shots from above, that's your signal to attack." "Absolutely not," Sheriff Bradley protested. "I'm not sending a woman and a boy on the most dangerous part of this mission." Sarah Beth fixed him with a stare that could have melted steel. "Sheriff, I can outshoot most of the men in this territory, and Timothy knows this desert better than anyone his age has a right to. We're small, we're quiet, and we're motivated. Most importantly, we're the ones least likely to be expected." It was a compelling argument, and Bradley knew it. In his years as a lawman, he had learned to recognize when someone had made up their mind so completely that arguing was useless. "If you're going to do this fool thing, you'll need more than just rifles," Carlos said. He reached into his saddlebags and pulled out a bundle wrapped in oiled leather. Inside were 2 sticks of dynamite, carefully packed with fuses and percussion caps. "Where did you get those?" Bradley asked, surprised. "My cousin works for the mining company up in Silver Creek. These were left over from blasting operations." Carlos handed the explosives to Sarah Beth with great care. "You know how to use them?" "I helped my father blast out a well last summer," she replied, tucking the dynamite into her pack. "Light the fuse, throw it, and get behind something solid." The plan was settled quickly. Sarah Beth and Timothy would take the Ghost Trail, a journey that would require most of the day even if everything went perfectly. Sheriff Bradley and the others would wait until late afternoon, then approach the outlaw stronghold from the front, making enough noise to draw attention while staying in cover. If Jake was still alive, they would have one chance to save him. The siblings said goodbye to their horses with real sadness. Luna and Thunder had carried them faithfully through many adventures, and leaving them behind felt like abandoning family members. But the Ghost Trail was no place for horses, especially the narrow section that Carlos's grandfather had marked as Paso de la Muerte, the Passage of Death. With their rifles slung across their backs and packs loaded with water, ammunition, and the precious dynamite, Sarah Beth and Timothy began their climb toward the canyon rim. The path was barely visible, marked only by occasional cairns left by ancient travelers and the rare scratch marks where mountain sheep had passed. The first part of the climb was merely difficult. Loose shale and crumbling sandstone made every step treacherous, and the narrow path wound around the face of cliffs where a single misstep would mean a fall of hundreds of feet. But both siblings had grown up scrambling over rocks and desert terrain, and they made steady progress. It was when they reached the rim of the canyon that the real challenge began. Here the Ghost Trail lived up to its ominous name. The path, such as it was, followed a knife-edge ridge barely 3 feet wide, with 1,000-foot drops on both sides. Ancient petroglyphs on the few flat rock surfaces showed that this route had been used for centuries, but always with reverence and fear. "Don't look down," Timothy advised, though he was having trouble following his own advice. "Too late," Sarah Beth replied through gritted teeth. The view from the ridge was simultaneously breathtaking and terrifying. The entire canyon system spread out below them like a miniature world, with the red rock formations creating patterns that seemed almost too perfect to be natural. But there was no time to admire the scenery. Every moment they delayed was another moment Jake remained in the hands of his captors. They pressed on, moving carefully but steadily along the treacherous ridge. Halfway across the worst section, they encountered the passage that Carlos's grandfather had marked as deadly. Here, the trail narrowed to less than 2 feet, and the rock face was smooth and slick from centuries of wind erosion. Handholds were scarce, and the drop on either side disappeared into blue shadows. "I'll go first," Timothy said, but Sarah Beth was already moving. "We go together," she decided. "If one of us falls, maybe the other can help." Step by careful step, they inched across the passage of death. Sarah Beth's wedding dress would have been completely impractical for this kind of travel, but her riding clothes allowed her the freedom of movement she needed. Still, she found herself wishing she had worn Timothy's spare boots instead of her own. His had better grip on the slick stone. 20 minutes that felt like hours later, they reached the other side of the passage and collapsed gratefully on a wider section of trail. Their hands were shaking from the combination of fear and the physical strain of maintaining perfect balance for so long. "I never want to do that again," Timothy gasped. "Let's hope we don't have to," Sarah Beth replied. But privately, she knew they would have to cross that same passage on the way back, assuming they lived long enough to make a return trip. The afternoon sun was beginning to cast long shadows by the time they reached their destination, a rocky outcrop that overlooked the hidden valley where Black Jack Cordero had made his stronghold. And what a stronghold it was. The valley was much larger than either sibling had expected, perhaps 2 miles long and half a mile wide. A clear stream ran down the center, providing fresh water year-round. Natural caves in the valley walls had been enlarged and fortified, creating comfortable living quarters that would be nearly impossible to attack from ground level. But most impressive was the number of people below. This wasn't just an outlaw gang, it was a small army. Sarah Beth counted at least 30 men, along with a dozen women and several children. Horses grazed in a natural corral formed by rock walls, and the smell of cooking fires drifted up from the valley floor. "My God," Timothy whispered. "There are families down there." It was true, and it complicated everything. The women and children weren't outlaws. They were camp followers, wives, daughters, and sons of men who had chosen to live outside the law. Some might have been kidnapped, others were probably there willingly, but all of them were innocents who would be caught in the crossfire if the rescue attempt went wrong. But then Sarah Beth spotted something that made her blood run cold. In the center of the valley, near what appeared to be the main camp, a man was tied to a wooden post. Even at this distance, she recognized the broad shoulders and dark hair of Jake Morrison. He was alive, but for how long? Jake Morrison hung from the wooden post like a scarecrow, his wrists bound with rawhide that had been soaked and left to dry, causing it to tighten as it shrank. His shirt was torn and blood-stained, and even from their position high above the valley, Sarah Beth could see that he was barely conscious. "That's him," she whispered, her voice tight with rage and fear. "What are they doing to him?" Timothy pulled out the small spyglass their father had given him for his last birthday, a prized possession that had helped him spot cattle thieves and track game across the vast desert. Through the lens, the scene below became horrifyingly clear. Black Jack Cordero himself stood near the prisoner, a tall man with coal-black hair and a beard that gave him the appearance of a dangerous prophet. He wore a black leather vest over a white shirt, with silver conchos decorating his gun belt. Even from a distance, there was something magnetic and terrifying about his presence, the kind of natural leadership that could inspire men to follow him into hell itself. Around him, his men moved with the easy confidence of those who had never been successfully challenged. Sarah Beth recognized the type from her father's stories of the Civil War, hardened fighters who had learned to kill without hesitation and sleep soundly afterward. But it was the women and children that made the situation truly complex. They weren't prisoners, at least not in the traditional sense. Sarah Beth watched as one woman tended a cooking fire while her young son played nearby with wooden toys. Another woman was hanging laundry on lines strung between cave entrances. These people had made this valley their home, and they would fight to defend it just as fiercely as any homesteader protecting their farm. "How long do you think Jake can hold out?" Timothy asked, his young voice heavy with concern. Sarah Beth studied their target through the spyglass. Jake's head hung forward, but she could see his chest rising and falling with labored breaths. Occasionally he would raise his head and look around, suggesting that he was still conscious and aware of his surroundings. "He's tougher than rawhide," she said with forced optimism. "But we need to move soon. Black Jack's not keeping him alive for his health, he wants something from him." As if summoned by her words, Black Jack approached the prisoner and began speaking. Even at this distance, his gestures suggested he was asking questions, probably about the location of other lawmen or the schedule of gold shipments through the territory. Jake's response was barely visible, a slight shake of his head. Black Jack's reaction was swift and violent. He backhanded the prisoner across the face with enough force to snap Jake's head to the side. Sarah Beth's finger tightened on her rifle trigger before she caught herself. One shot from up here would certainly kill Black Jack Cordero, but it would also doom Jake and alert the entire camp to their presence. She forced herself to wait, though every instinct screamed at her to act. "The sun's getting low," Timothy observed. "Sheriff Bradley and the others will be moving into position soon." Indeed, the late afternoon sun was painting the canyon walls in shades of gold and crimson that gave the place its name. In perhaps 2 hours, darkness would begin to fall, and with it would come their one chance to rescue Jake Morrison. Sarah Beth began studying the layout of the valley more carefully, looking for the best positions to place their charges and create maximum confusion. The dynamite Carlos had given them was precious. They would only get one chance to use it effectively. "There," she pointed to a rock formation that overlooked the main camp. "If we can get a stick of dynamite up there and time it right, the rock slide will block their escape route through the main canyon." Timothy nodded, following her logic. "And the second stick?" "The horse corral. Stampede their mounts and they can't chase us once we grab Jake." It was a solid plan, but it depended on split-second timing and a generous helping of luck. Too early, and they would alert the outlaws before Sheriff Bradley's diversionary attack began. Too late, and Jake might be dead before they could reach him. As they waited for the sun to sink lower, Sarah Beth found herself thinking about all the things she had wanted to say to Jake at their wedding. The vows they had written together during long evenings on her parents' porch, the promises they had made about building a life together in this harsh but beautiful land. She had planned to tell him that she loved not just his courage and honor, but also his gentleness with children and his habit of bringing her wildflowers for no reason at all. She had wanted to promise that she would stand by him through whatever dangers and hardships frontier life might bring. Now, instead of making those vows in a church surrounded by friends and family, she was preparing to fight for his life with a rifle and stolen dynamite. "Sarah Beth," Timothy said softly, perhaps sensing the direction of her thoughts. "When we get Jake back, not if, when, are you still going to marry him?" The question surprised her. "Of course. Why would you ask that?" "Because after today, after everything that's happened, you'll both be different people. Sometimes that changes things between folks." It was a remarkably mature observation from her 15-year-old brother, and it showed how much the frontier had aged him beyond his years. Timothy had seen enough of life's hardships to understand that people could be changed by trauma and violence. "Maybe we will be different," Sarah Beth acknowledged. "But some things don't change. I love Jake Morrison not because he's a perfect hero, but because he's a good man who tries to do the right thing even when it's hard. Whatever happens down there, that's not going to change." Their conversation was interrupted by movement in the valley below. Several of Black Jack's men were mounting up and riding toward the main canyon entrance. Scouts, probably, or guards being positioned for the night. The sight reminded both siblings that they were running out of time. "We need to get into position," Sarah Beth decided. They spent the next hour working their way down from the rim toward the valley floor, using a treacherous path that hadn't seen human traffic in decades. Ancient handholds carved into the rock face showed where cliff-dwelling people had once made this descent regularly, but time and weather had made many of those holds unreliable. The path brought them to a ledge about 100 feet above the valley floor, positioned perfectly to overlook the outlaw camp. From here they could see Jake clearly, still alive, still defiant, but obviously weakening from thirst and the effects of his beating. Sarah Beth positioned the first stick of dynamite carefully, wedging it into a crack in the rock face where it would bring down a substantial slide. The fuse was long enough to give them time to reach the second position, but not so long that someone might spot it and cut it before the explosion. The second position required them to work their way around the valley wall to a point overlooking the horse corral. This was more dangerous as they would be visible to anyone who happened to look up, but the growing darkness provided some cover. As Sarah Beth placed the second charge, Timothy kept watch with the spyglass. "I can see Sheriff Bradley," he whispered excitedly. "He's at the canyon mouth with the others." The diversionary attack was about to begin. In the valley below, the outlaws were settling in for the evening, unaware that their comfortable sanctuary was about to become a battlefield. Black Jack Cordero emerged from one of the larger caves, and even from this distance, his commanding presence was obvious. He walked directly to where Jake hung from the post and began speaking again, his gestures becoming more animated and threatening. This time, Jake raised his head and spoke back, his voice carrying faintly up the canyon walls. Sarah Beth couldn't make out the words, but the defiant tone was unmistakable. Black Jack's response was swift and brutal. He drew his pistol and struck Jake across the temple with the barrel, sending the deputy marshal's head snapping to one side. Blood ran down Jake's face, dark in the evening light. "That's enough," Sarah Beth growled, reaching for the fuse on the first dynamite charge. But Timothy caught her arm. "Wait. Listen." From the direction of the main canyon came the sound they had been waiting for, gunshots, echoing off the stone walls in a rolling crescendo. Sheriff Bradley's attack had begun. The effect on the outlaw camp was immediate and dramatic. Men grabbed rifles and pistols, shouting orders and questions in English and Spanish. Women gathered children and hurried them toward the safety of the caves. The peaceful evening scene transformed into chaos within seconds. Black Jack himself seemed unaffected by the sudden alarm. He holstered his pistol and called out orders to his men with the calm authority of a military commander. Sarah Beth had to admit, grudgingly, that the man was a natural leader, even if he used those talents for evil purposes. "Now," Sarah Beth whispered, striking a match and touching it to the first fuse. The fuse caught with a brief flare of sparks, then settled into a steady burn that would consume the 6 inches of cord in about 2 minutes. That gave them just enough time to reach the second charge and light it before the first explosion. They scrambled around the valley wall as quickly as they dared, with the sound of gunfire from the canyon mouth growing louder and more intense. Sheriff Bradley and his men were doing their job, drawing the outlaws' attention and making them think the attack was coming from the obvious direction. The second fuse was just catching fire when the first stick of dynamite exploded with a thunderous roar that shook the entire valley. A section of the canyon wall collapsed in a grinding avalanche of red sandstone, completely blocking the main escape route and sending a cloud of dust billowing across the camp. The explosion had an even more dramatic effect than Sarah Beth had hoped. Several outlaws who had been positioning themselves near the blocked passage were caught in the rockslide, their screams lost in the rumble of falling stone. More importantly, the blast created confusion and panic among people who had thought their stronghold was impregnable. But Black Jack Cordero was not the kind of man to panic easily. Even as dust settled around the camp and his men ran in all directions, he drew his knife and strode purposefully toward Jake Morrison. If he couldn't escape with his prisoner, he was going to make sure no one else could rescue him. "He's going to kill Jake," Timothy shouted over the ringing in their ears from the explosion. The second charge detonated just as Black Jack reached the prisoner. The explosion scattered the horse herd in a wild stampede, but more importantly, it knocked the outlaw leader off his feet and sent his knife spinning away into the darkness. Sarah Beth didn't hesitate. While the camp was still reeling from the double explosion, she grabbed her rifle and began the dangerous descent to the valley floor. There was no path here, just a steep slope of loose rock and thorny desert plants that tore at her clothes and skin. Timothy followed close behind, his young legs finding purchase on holds that would have challenged a mountain goat. Both siblings moved with the desperate speed of people who knew they had only minutes before the outlaws recovered their composure. The valley floor was a chaos of dust, screaming horses and shouting men. The combination of Sheriff Bradley's frontal attack and the unexpected explosions from above had completely disrupted Black Jack's defensive plans. Several of his men were firing wildly into the darkness, unsure where the real threat was coming from. Sarah Beth reached Jake first, her knife already out to cut his bonds. Up close, his injuries looked even worse. His face was swollen and bloody, and his breathing was shallow and labored. "Jake," she whispered urgently, sawing at the rawhide ropes. "Jake, can you hear me?" His eyes opened, gray eyes that had looked at her with love just days ago, now clouded with pain but still aware. "Sarah Beth? How did you—" "Never mind. Get out of here. It's not safe." "I'm not leaving without you," she replied, cutting through the last of his bonds. Jake sagged forward, his legs too weak to support him after hours of hanging from the post. Timothy arrived just as Sarah Beth caught Jake's weight. "Can he walk?" "We'll find out," she said grimly, draping one of Jake's arms over her shoulder while Timothy took the other side. But they had been spotted. Across the dusty chaos of the camp, Black Jack Cordero was getting to his feet and reaching for another weapon. Even bruised and shaken by the explosion, he moved with deadly purpose. "You've caused me considerable trouble, Deputy Morrison," he called out, his voice carrying clearly across the valley. "And you, Miss Thompson, I know who you are. Your reputation with a rifle has reached even these remote canyons." Sarah Beth helped Jake take a stumbling step toward the valley wall, where a narrow path led up toward safety. But she could feel Black Jack's eyes on them, calculating distances and angles. "I'm impressed," the outlaw leader continued, drawing a second pistol from his belt. "Most women would have stayed home and mourned their lost love. But you came into my territory, destroyed my escape route, and scattered my horses. That shows remarkable courage, or remarkable foolishness." "Keep moving," Sarah Beth whispered to Jake and Timothy. They were still 50 yards from the base of the path, and Black Jack was raising his gun with the steady aim of a man who had killed many times before. The shot, when it came, was not from Black Jack's pistol but from the canyon mouth. Sheriff Bradley and his men had fought their way through the outlaw defenses and reached the valley floor. Their rifles cracked in a ragged volley, forcing Black Jack and his remaining men to dive for cover behind rocks and overturned supply wagons. "This way," Bradley shouted, waving his hat to get their attention. "We've got horses waiting." But the path to Sheriff Bradley led directly through the crossfire between the lawmen and the outlaws. Jake was in no condition for a running gun battle, and Timothy, for all his courage, was still just a 15-year-old boy. Sarah Beth made a decision that would have seemed impossible just hours earlier. She handed Jake's weight entirely to Timothy and unslung her rifle. "Get him out of here," she ordered her brother. "Follow that path up the wall. I'll cover you." "Sarah Beth, no." Jake protested, but his voice was weak and his legs wouldn't support him without help. "Go!" she shouted, already moving toward better cover behind a fallen boulder. Black Jack had spotted her movement and was shifting his aim in her direction. For a moment, their eyes met across the dust and chaos of the battlefield. The outlaw leader who had terrorized the territory for months, and the young woman who had invaded his stronghold to rescue the man she loved. "You should have stayed home and played with your dollies, little girl," Black Jack called out mockingly. Sarah Beth's response was to put a rifle bullet through his hat, close enough to part his hair. "I was never much good with dollies," she replied. The personal duel that followed would become the stuff of frontier legend. Black Jack Cordero was fast with a gun, faster than most men had lived to tell about. But Sarah Beth Thompson had learned to shoot from her father, who had survived 4 years of Civil War combat, and she had practiced until she could put 5 shots through a silver dollar at 50 yards. More importantly, she was fighting for more than just her life. She was fighting for her future, for the man she loved, and for the right to live free from the kind of fear that men like Black Jack Cordero brought to the frontier. The gun battle lasted less than 2 minutes but felt like hours. Black Jack fired 3 times, his bullets chipping stone near Sarah Beth's head and tearing through her sleeve. But Sarah Beth's return shots were more accurate, forcing the outlaw leader to abandon one position after another as her rifle found the range. It ended when Black Jack made the mistake of exposing himself too long while moving between 2 boulders. Sarah Beth's 4th shot took him in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his pistol flying into the dust. The fight went out of the remaining outlaws when their leader fell. Faced with rifles from the canyon mouth and the deadly accuracy of the young woman who had outgunned their boss, they began throwing down their weapons and raising their hands. Sheriff Bradley and his men moved quickly to secure the prisoners while Sarah Beth ran to where Timothy was helping Jake up the narrow path. The deputy marshal was conscious but barely able to walk, his face gray with pain and exhaustion. "Is it over?" Jake asked as Sarah Beth took his other arm. "It's over," she confirmed, looking back at the valley where Black Jack Cordero sat propped against a rock, bleeding from his shoulder but alive. "You're safe now." But even as she said the words, Sarah Beth knew that nothing would ever be quite the same. The wedding dress waiting back in Dusty Creek belonged to a different woman, one who had never killed or faced death in a gunfight. The woman helping Jake Morrison up this treacherous path was someone new, forged in the crucible of the Crimson Canyon battle. The journey back to Dusty Creek took 3 days, slowed by Jake's injuries and the need to transport prisoners. Black Jack Cordero, his shoulder bandaged but his spirit unbroken, rode in the back of a commandeered wagon along with 6 of his men who had survived the battle. The others were dead, wounded, or had escaped into the maze of canyons during the confusion. Sheriff Bradley had made the decision to leave the women and children in the valley, at least temporarily. Most were wives and daughters of the captured outlaws, and they had committed no crimes beyond choosing to follow their men into the wilderness. A territorial judge would have to decide their ultimate fate, but Bradley saw no point in tearing families apart unnecessarily. Sarah Beth rode beside the wagon carrying Jake, who was conscious but still weak from his ordeal. Doc Henderson, who had insisted on joining the rescue party despite his age, had treated Jake's injuries as best he could with the supplies available. The deputy marshal had 3 cracked ribs, a concussion and various cuts and bruises, but he would recover fully given time and rest. "You know," Jake said during one of their rest stops, his voice still hoarse but gaining strength, This wasn't exactly how I pictured spending my wedding week. Sarah Beth smiled, the first genuine smile she had managed since the whole ordeal began. Well, most couples don't have quite this much excitement during their courtship. Most couples don't have a bride who can outshoot Black Jack Cordero, Timothy added with obvious pride in his sister. The story of the gun battle was already growing in the telling. Each time one of the posse members recounted the events to someone new, Sarah Beth's shooting became more miraculous and Black Jack's reputation more fearsome. By the time they reached Dusty Creek, the tale would probably have Sarah Beth shooting the guns out of a dozen outlaws' hands while riding bareback through a hail of bullets. But the reality was impressive enough. Word of the battle had spread ahead of them through the network of ranches, way stations, and mining camps that dotted the territory. Telegraph operators tapped out the news in Morse code, and newspaper editors in Phoenix and Tucson began composing headlines about the shootout at Crimson Canyon. On the second night of their journey, camped beside a small creek with guards posted and the prisoners secured, Jake finally felt strong enough for a serious conversation. "Sarah Beth," he said, taking her hand as they sat a little apart from the others, "I need to know something. After what happened, after what you had to do you still want to marry a lawman?" The question had been weighing on his mind ever since he regained full consciousness. He had seen what violence could do to people, how it could change them in ways that never fully healed. The thought that he might have brought such trauma into Sarah Beth's life filled him with guilt. Sarah Beth was quiet for a long moment, staring up at the stars that seemed impossibly bright in the clear desert air. When she finally spoke, her voice was thoughtful and sure. "Jake, I fell in love with a man who stood up for what was right even when it was dangerous. What happened in that canyon? It was terrible, and yes, it changed me. But it didn't change how I feel about you. If anything, it made me understand better what you face every time you pin on that badge." She turned to look at him directly, her green eyes reflecting the firelight. "I'm not the same woman who put on that wedding dress 3 days ago. That woman had never killed anyone or faced death in a gunfight. But I'm still the woman who loves Jake Morrison and wants to build a life with him." Jake felt a weight lift from his shoulders that he hadn't even realized he was carrying. "And I'm still the man who wants to marry Sarah Beth Thompson, whether she's wearing a wedding dress or gun leather." They were married 2 weeks later, after Jake had recovered enough to stand through the ceremony without assistance. The wedding was smaller than originally planned. Several of the intended guests were still recovering from wounds received in the canyon battle, but it was no less joyful for that. Sarah Beth wore her grandmother's wedding dress, which her mother had carefully cleaned and mended. But she also wore something new, a gun belt of tooled leather, crafted by the finest leather worker in Phoenix and presented to her by the grateful territorial governor. The accompanying Colt .45 was engraved with her name and a simple inscription, "To the Bride of Crimson Canyon." The nickname stuck, though Sarah Beth never particularly liked it. Newspaper writers and dime novelists seized on the story, turning her into a larger-than-life figure who could shoot the wings off a fly at 100 yards while reciting poetry. The real Sarah Beth was content to be a lawman's wife, helping to bring order and civilization to a wild territory. 5 years later, Dusty Creek had grown into a proper town with paved streets, gas lamps, and a railroad depot. The Arizona Territory was changing rapidly, transforming from a frontier wilderness into a place where families could build stable, prosperous lives. Jake Morrison had been elected sheriff of the county, a position that carried more respect than danger as the days of major outlaw gangs faded into memory. He and Sarah Beth had built a house on the hill overlooking town, with a view that stretched all the way to the red cliffs of Crimson Canyon. They had 2 children, a daughter named Margaret after Sarah Beth's mother, and a son they called Thomas but who answered to Tommy. Both children were being raised with the practical skills needed for frontier life, but also with books, music, and the refinements their parents had learned from their own families back east. Black Jack Cordero had been sentenced to life in the territorial prison in Yuma, where the desert heat and hard labor were slowly breaking down his once formidable constitution. Several of his men had been hanged, others sentenced to long prison terms. The women and children from the canyon had been relocated to various towns throughout the territory, most of them adapting successfully to law-abiding lives. The hidden valley in Crimson Canyon had been turned into a cattle ranch, purchased by an investment group from Chicago who saw opportunity in the natural water sources and defensible terrain. The caves where the outlaws had lived were now used to store hay and equipment, and the stream that had once watered stolen horses now supported herds of legitimate cattle. But the story of the shootout at Crimson Canyon lived on, growing more elaborate with each telling. Traveling showmen performed dramatic recreations in dusty town squares, complete with blank cartridges and carefully choreographed gunfights. Dime novelists churned out dozens of stories featuring thinly disguised versions of Sarah Beth and Jake, usually with titles like The Bride's Revenge or Guns and Wedding Bells. The real participants in the battle had mixed feelings about their sudden fame. Sheriff Bradley found the attention amusing and sometimes useful in dealing with potential troublemakers who had heard the stories. Timothy Thompson, now 20 and working as a deputy, enjoyed the respect that came with being the brother of the bride of Crimson Canyon, but he also felt the pressure to live up to the legend. Sarah Beth herself had perhaps the most complex relationship with her unwanted fame. She appreciated that the story had become a symbol of frontier courage and determination, but she was uncomfortable with the way it was often told. Too many versions emphasized the gun battle while ignoring the real point, that ordinary people could find extraordinary courage when they fought for something they loved. On quiet evenings, when the children were asleep and the desert wind whispered through the cottonwoods around their house, Jake and Sarah Beth would sometimes talk about that terrible and wonderful day in the canyon. They would remember the friends they had lost, the risks they had taken, and the way their love had been tested and proven stronger than they had ever imagined. "Do you ever regret it?" Jake asked one such evening, sitting on their front porch with his arm around his wife. "Not marrying me, but the way it happened. The violence, the danger, the way it changed everything." Sarah Beth considered the question seriously, as she always did. In the distance, the red walls of Crimson Canyon caught the last light of sunset, glowing like embers in the gathering darkness. "I regret that good men died," she said finally. "I regret that children had to see violence and that families were torn apart. But I don't regret fighting for what was right, and I don't regret proving that love is stronger than fear." She turned to look at him, her green eyes still holding the same depth that had captured his heart years ago. "We could have had a quiet wedding followed by a quiet life. But that wouldn't have been us, would it? We're people who stand up when standing up is needed, who fight when fighting is necessary. That day in the canyon didn't change who we were. It revealed who we were." Jake nodded, understanding completely. They were products of their time and place, shaped by the demands of frontier life into people who could face any challenge together. Their love story was written in gunpowder and courage, in the red stone of desert canyons and the endless blue of western skies. Years passed, and the American West continued its transformation from frontier to settled land. The Apache Wars ended, the railroad connected distant cities and territories became states. The time of gunfighters and cattle barons gave way to an era of oil wells and automobiles. But in the red rock country of Arizona, where ancient peoples had once built cities in the cliffs and Spanish explorers had searched for cities of gold, the story of the shootout at Crimson Canyon lived on. It became part of the region's folklore, passed down through generations of families who had made their homes in the desert. The story survived because it spoke to something fundamental about the American experience. The belief that ordinary people could rise to meet extraordinary challenges, that love and courage could triumph over fear and violence, and that sometimes the most important battles were fought not by armies or governments, but by individuals who refused to surrender what they held dear. Today, Crimson Canyon is part of a national monument, protected by federal law and visited by thousands of tourists each year. The ancient petroglyphs still decorate the canyon walls, telling their wordless stories of peoples and times long vanished. The hidden valley where Black Jack Cordero made his stronghold is now a popular camping spot for hikers and rock climbers. A small plaque near the canyon entrance commemorates the events of that long-ago day. On this site in 1885, Deputy Marshal Jake Morrison was rescued from outlaw captivity by a volunteer posse led by his fiancée, Sarah Beth Thompson. The gun battle that followed broke up the Crimson Canyon Gang and helped bring peace to the Arizona Territory. Their story reminds us that courage comes in many forms, and that love can inspire people to achievements they never thought possible. Park rangers sometimes tell the story to visitors, though they're careful to separate fact from fiction in the many versions that have grown up over the years. The basic truth remains compelling. A young woman put on gun leather instead of a wedding dress and rode into an outlaw stronghold to save the man she loved. The house that Jake and Sarah Beth built still stands on the hill overlooking what is now the city of Dusty Creek, Arizona. It's been converted into a museum, with displays showing artifacts from the territorial period and photographs of the people who helped bring civilization to a wild land. Visitors can see Sarah Beth's wedding dress, carefully preserved, alongside the gun belt she wore to Crimson Canyon. But perhaps the most moving display is a simple glass case containing two items: a bent deputy's badge found on the canyon floor after the battle, and a pressed desert marigold, saved from Sarah Beth's wedding bouquet. Together they tell the story better than any amount of words, a story of duty and love, of violence and healing, of ordinary people who found themselves capable of extraordinary things. The American West was built by such people, men and women who faced an uncertain future with courage and determination, who created communities out of empty desert, and who proved that civilization was not about buildings or laws, but about the willingness of individuals to stand together against chaos and darkness. The shootout at Crimson Canyon lasted only minutes, but its echoes still resonate in the red stone walls where ancient peoples once painted their dreams and fears. It reminds us that every generation faces its own challenges, its own tests of courage and character. The weapons may change, the enemies may take different forms, but the fundamental choice remains the same: to stand up for what is right, to protect what we love, and to face the future with hope instead of fear. In the end, that may be the most important lesson of Sarah Beth Thompson Morrison's story. She became a legend not because she was perfect, but because she was human, flawed, frightened, but ultimately courageous enough to act when action was needed. Her wedding day became a battle, but her marriage became a symbol of the love and partnership that built the American West. The red walls of Crimson Canyon still catch the light at sunset, still glow like embers against the darkening sky. And somewhere in that ancient light, the spirits of all who fought for love and justice in this harsh and beautiful land live on, reminding each new generation that courage is not the absence of fear, but the determination to do what is right despite that fear. The bride left behind became the bride who fought back, and in doing so she became part of the eternal story of the American frontier, a story still being written by those who choose love over hate, courage over cowardice, and hope over despair. The canyon remembers and the legend lives on.